Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to all of you to this webinar on policy challenges posed by immigration, non-standard employment and remote working. My name is Andreas Villarreal. I will be your host and moderator for this workshop, a workshop that is organized within the context of the Horizon Europe Project TransEuroWorkS. And to hear a little bit more about it, I would like to give the floor to one of its coordinators, namely Olaf van Vliet. Olaf, if you would be so kind.
Very much, Andreas. So, welcome to this workshop, to this webinar. My name is Olaf van Vliet. I'm the coordinator of TransEuroWorkS and professor at Leiden University. Welcome on behalf of the entire project. In the meantime, I would also like to welcome all our speakers, so members of the project, the partners of the project, and also the discussants from the European Commission, from the European Social Observatory, from Eurofound, from EUI, from ETUI. Welcome to this afternoon. And in particular, this workshop has been organized by Andreas from Zabela and by Jonas Pontensen from the University of Geneva. So welcome again also to Francesco from the European Commission, who was actually involved when we designed the project in the previous role. Welcome again. So today we will present some of the results of our project, and in particular also the policy implications. And I'm very happy with all the discussants that we have invited and that were who were so friendly to accept the invitation. And the idea is to have a discussion this afternoon about the policy implication of our results. And I would also like to invite the audience to participate this afternoon. I will briefly introduce our project. Could you please go to the next slide? So 3-4 years ago, we started the project with the following idea. We have focused on 3 major economic structural changes, namely globalization, technological change, so digitalization and automation, and the green transition, so decarbonization. And the idea is that all these 3 major structural transformations have an effect on the labor market, on jobs, on sectors, on occupations, on the labor force. And by then we had included globalization, but we didn't know by then yet how relevant globalization in terms of international trade, but also trade barriers would be today. We analyze the effect of these 3 economic transformations on labor markets, on sectors, and we can expect that in some sectors jobs will disappear as a result of globalization or of automation or the green transition, whereas in other sectors we could expect a growth in employment. There will be new occupations. So that is one effect that we could expect. On the other hand, we could also expect more flexibilization on the labor market because of these changes. And because of that, we can expect an increasing share of non-standard employment, for instance, part-time employment and temporary employment. That's also an important part of our project. And of course, you could also think of changes as the fact that more and more people are actually working remote. People are working from home, especially since the pandemic. But of course, also this is driven to some extent by digitalization. And that's actually the orange box in this graph. And finally, the question is, how could welfare state programs, how could social policies facilitate and accommodate these transitions on the labor market? Think about family policies, or more generally active labor market policy and social investment policies. So in a nutshell, these are the large economic structural transformations, the impact of that on the labor market, on people, on workers, on households, and how could welfare state programs and social policies accommodate all these changes. That is, in a nutshell, the big underlying question of our project. And of course, many of these developments and challenges actually overlap. Next slide, please. As I said in the very beginning, Leiden University is part of a wide consortium. As you can see here, in total we have 9 universities and research institutes from Europe. You can see them in red, and in orange you can see our stakeholders. And here you see a picture from our last consortium meeting a few weeks ago in Leiden. Next slide, please. So now I will present some of the findings of one of the work packages, which is about the fiscal impact of migration. Next slide, please. Also, next slide, please. So that would be about these two circles in green. So the impact of this increased mobility of the labor force within the EU, and the impact of that on the welfare states. Next slide, please. So in politics, also in recent election campaigns, migration has been a very important topic, has been very salient for the past decades. Of course, for several reasons, and in general, there are two classes of explanations. One is two types of concerns. One is related to cultural concerns, related to identity, religion, and the second strand is related to economic concerns. I think about labor market effects, but also the impact of migration on the welfare state. And if you look at European newspapers, you can actually find that politicians are concerned about the impact of migration on the sustainability of the welfare state. Next slide, please. Surprisingly, against the background of all these political debates, the amount of empirical evidence of the empirical insights on the impact of migration on welfare states is actually rather limited. And on the one hand, you could expect that against the background of the literature on welfare magnates, and that migrants would be attracted by generous welfare programs, that could in itself put pressure on public finances and on the sustainability of welfare state programs. And at the same time, against a background of aging societies, of course, another line of reasoning is that actually migrants could contribute to the sustainability of pension systems and other welfare state programs. As I said, the amount of empirical evidence is rather limited, so the main motivation of our study in this work package is to provide empirical insight in this whole debate about the net fiscal position of migrants. Next slide, please. We do that based on two TransEuroWorkS working papers. The first actually is still under review. That is the left one, and the right one was also a working paper, but a few weeks ago it has been published by a journal, the journal International Tax and Public pilots. Next slide, please. In the first paper, we explore trends. So we look at 15 EU countries, and we explore trends in the net fiscal positions of natives, intra-EU migrants. Technically speaking, intra-EU migrants, they aren't migrants, but they are mobile EU citizens, and extra-EU migrants for 15 EU countries for the period 2007-2018. In the second paper, we focus on the observable factors that contribute to the difference between this fiscal impact between migrants and natives. So in the second paper, we try to explore and to explain why the net fiscal positions of migrants and natives differ, and how these factors have evolved over time. Next slide, please. So what is actually the net fiscal position? Basically, it could be understood as the difference between the taxes and the social security contributions paid to the government, and the benefits received from the government. And the difference between these two things is the net fiscal position. And if you pay more taxes than you receive benefits, then the net fiscal position is a positive number, and the other way around. Of course, if you do such an, let's say, an accountancy type of exercise, you have to make a number of assumptions, because you have to use harmonized definitions in the data, and because of that, it's good to be careful when using the data. Previous slide, please. Previous slide. One back, please. Yeah. So because of these limitations, it's good to be careful. We have data for 15 EU countries. For most of the countries, we are able to make a distinction between intra-EU and extra-EU migrants, but not for all of them. Next slide, please. So, and here are our main results. Here you see 3 trends for the native borns, for intra-EU migrants, and for extra-EU migrants between 2007 and 2018. And interestingly, as you can see, the net fiscal position is negative in all countries. So here you see 3 trends, but I should stress that in the data, of course, we have almost 3 million individuals across Europe. So what you see here is are the net fiscal contributions, the net fiscal positions of around 3 million individuals based on EU Silk data. As you can see, the net fiscal position is on average negative for all 3 groups. That might be surprising, but actually it isn't, if you think about it, because if you think about it, in all these countries we have budget deficits, and that's the main explanation for why we have negative net fiscal positions. Of course, that's not the full story, because of course you also have, let's say, corporate taxes and so on. But in general, that's the reason why they are negative in all the countries. And interestingly, what you can see then is that for both extra and intra-EU migrants, the net fiscal position is less negative than for natives. That's one of the main findings. The second main finding, as you can see, is that there is a clear decline in the trend around the financial crisis, around 2010. And a few years later, the net fiscal position starts to increase again for the 2 migrant groups, whereas it does not recover for the natives. Probably because exactly during those years, the aging of the populations across European countries starts to kick in. So it's important to already mention, to explain that what we are looking at is largely driven by composition effects. So, for instance, the average age is higher among natives than among migrants. And that implies that there are more people who receive pensions among the natives. So when the aging population starts to kick in after 2010, that is one of the main reasons why that curve doesn't increase again. Whereas for the younger group, for the migrants, it actually does start to recover after the financial crisis. So clearly, why do we see this decline around the financial crisis? Because the unemployment rate increased, so people received more benefits and paid less taxes and contributions. So that's what we see here. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is basically what I just said. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here is a decomposition analysis. So basically, the red bars are the net fiscal position without control variables, so without controlling for background characteristics of the individuals, namely gender, age, and so on. The blue bar, so as soon as we include these background characteristics and as soon as we correct the net fiscal position for these background characteristics, you see that the net fiscal position becomes more negative. So if you look at the red bars, they are positive, but when you correct for the differences in the composition, you see that in almost all the countries, not all, but almost all countries, the net fiscal position becomes negative. So the main point is here that the difference in net fiscal position is not driven by the fact whether you are a migrant or not, but by background characteristics, namely age, level of education. These are the two main underlying factors which drive these results. Another interesting point is here that we show the variation between countries, and that is related to different welfare state systems between these countries on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is related to the different composition of migrants across these countries. Because of course the composition of those migrants is not exactly the same in those countries. And that's what we see here. Next slide, please. Then we look at this factor, so the role of being a migrant or not, the role of the migrant status over time. And we do that for the analysis with and without controls. And as you can see, the gap is widening between migrants and natives. So this is let's say the same trend as we just saw a few slides ago when we looked at the trends over time, and we saw that there was a difference after the financial crisis. Well, that's what we see here. But you see that that as soon as you add control variables, you also reduce the gap between natives and migrants. So the main difference between migrants and natives is driven again by these background characteristics. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's what I just said. So yeah, important point here is that when you add control variables, for intra-EU migrants, the effect is a little bit more positive than for extra-EU migrants. So there is a small difference between intra and extra-EU migrants. Next slide, please. So the main point is that there are three main factors here. So which is age, whether you are working age or when you are retired, level of education, and as expected, people with a higher level of education have a more positive net physical position, and the variation between countries. So these three factors are driving the results more than whether you are a migrant or not. And the most important factor is age. And interestingly, education does play a role for intra-EU migrants, but less so for extra-EU migrants. Next slide, please. So in terms of policy considerations, we could think of what does this difference between intra and extra EU migrants, what could that imply? Well, for instance, intra-EU migrants are better and more integrated on the labor market than extra EU migrants. So language courses could play an important role. And the second policy implication could be the recognition of educational accomplishments. Of course, degrees from within the EU are more recognized than degrees from outside the EU, and probably that does play a role in terms of incomes, in terms of labor market position. It is suggestive evidence because we cannot draw too strong conclusions based on the findings that we have regarding the role of education, but probably that would have an effect. So in terms of policy implications, it might be good to think about the recognition of degrees from outside the EU within the EU, because probably that would improve the labor market position and hence the net physical position of migrants. Thank you very, very much. Next slide, please. So the main conclusions again, so all groups have a negative net physical position between 2017 and 2018. The net physical position decreased during the financial crisis. It recovered from migrants afterwards, but not for natives. And the most important factors are age and education. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was Olaf van Vliet, professor at the Department of Economics and at the Institute of Public Administration at Leiden University, and also one of the coordinators of the TransEuroWorkS project. This was the first contribution to our initial panel on fiscal and social policy challenges posed by immigration and non-standard employment. For the second of our two discussants for this panel, I would like to call on a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Sociology at the University of Copenhagen, with research focusing on non-standard workers and their access to collective representation and social projection, including unemployment benefits, with her earlier work having focused on low-income citizens receiving social assistance, with particular attention to poverty, labor market integration, and social inclusion. If you would like to welcome Silvia Giraldi.
Thank you, Andreas, for the presentation. So today I will present some of work on non-standard employment and access to unemployment benefits that we did in the framework of the TransEuroWorkS projects, together with my colleagues Anna Ilso and Trine Pernille Larsen from the University of Copenhagen and Warwick University. The working paper underlined this I'm still on the first slide, yes. The working paper underlying this short presentation can be found also on the project website, just maybe if somebody wants to dig into that further. So the focus of this presentation is on how contractual flexibility shapes eligibility. So in other words, how different characteristics of non-standard jobs influence who actually access unemployment protection. Next. So non-standard employment forms are expanding and are becoming more diverse across European labor markets that we know. And this includes an expansion in part-time work, temporary contracts, platform work, and different other forms of self-employment. At the same time, social protection systems remain largely designed around the standard employment, so meaning like stable, full-time and open-ended jobs. And so this creates a clear mismatch. As a result, access to unemployment benefit is uneven, with some workers facing more barriers than others. So a key point here is that access depends not only on whether somebody is employed, but also on how their employment is structured. And this is particularly important because unemployment benefits are central for income security when jobs are lost, and this is especially important for workers in non-standard employment who tend to face greater instability. Next slide. So to explore this mismatch between non-standard employment and unequal access to unemployment benefits, we've used the concept of contractual flexibility. And by contractual flexibility, we mean the ways in which jobs deviate from standard full-time permanent employment. And we focus on 3 dimensions of contractual flexibility. The first dimension is employment status. So whether someone is an employee or self-employed. The second is contract duration, so whether the contract is temporary or open-ended. And the third is working hours, so whether work is full-time or part-time. So these 3 dimensions matter to study non-standard employment and access to unemployment benefits because they are directly linked to how eligibility rules are defined and therefore to whom can access unemployment benefits. So next slide. So empirically, we compare 6 countries: Denmark, Sweden, UK, Ireland, Slovakia, and Poland. And we've selected these countries as they reflect different types of welfare systems. Denmark and Sweden are usually considered more universalistic with a relatively inclusive social protection, while the UK and Ireland represent a more liberal model with more limited state intervention. And lastly, Slovakia and Poland are often described as being subprotective with less developed and less comprehensive systems in addressing social risks. This is an important note. In this work, we focus on formal eligibility rules for first access to unemployment benefits. And for each of these 3 dimensions of contractual flexibility, we assess whether they have a direct effect on eligibility, an indirect effect, or no effect at all. And this allows us to compare in a systematic way how different employment characteristics shape access to unemployment benefit. Next slide. So let me now turn to the main findings discussing these 3 dimensions of contractual flexibility. So first, we see that employment status has a direct effect in most countries. In practice, this means that self-employed workers often face additional conditions or are excluded from standard schemes. In some countries, self-employed have to close down their own self-employed activity before being able to request unemployment benefits, apply for unemployment benefits. So this is actually a key dimension in shaping access. The second dimension of contractual flexibility is contract duration. It matters in all countries, but indirectly, because this is not usually an eligibility criterion in itself, but it affects whether workers can actually build up sufficient contribution histories. So shorter or more fragmented contracts can make it harder for workers to qualify. And the third dimension of contractual flexibility is working hours. And here is where we see the most variation across countries. So in some cases, working hours determine directly eligibility through minimum hours thresholds. In other countries, they matter indirectly, for instance, through income requirements, meaning that eligibility depends on earnings above a certain threshold, which in turn depends on both how much you're paid and per hour and how many hours you work. And in some countries, working hours do not play a role at all in eligibility to unemployment benefits. So while some dimensions of contractual flexibility operate quite consistently across countries, working hours introduce a major source of variation across country. Next slide. So when we bring together when we bring these three dimensions together, we can look at the overall influence of contractual flexibility across country. And here our composite score captured this. Basically, the higher the score and the more these three dimensions matter to shape eligibility. And what we see is that this influence of contractual flexibility on access to unemployment benefits varies quite substantially. Some countries show a stronger overall effect, meaning that more aspects of contractual flexibility shape eligibility, while others show kind of weaker influence. However, these differences do not follow the usual welfare regime pattern. So this, I think, it's an interesting point of this work. So countries that we would have expected to be similar actually seem to differ a bit. And what seems to drive much of this variation observed in this composite score is how working hours are treated in eligibility rules. So let's say that rather than broad welfare system types, it is specific eligibility rules, especially those related to working times, that seem to appear to make a key difference across countries. So next. So what do we learn from this? So to conclude, we see that contractual flexibility, the three-dimensional contractual flexibility, play a key role in shaping access to unemployment protection. The different dimensions of flexibility matter, but in different ways. And eligibility rules, in a way, translate differences in non-standard work arrangement into unequal access to unemployment benefits. At the same time, these patterns do not seem to align with the standard welfare regime typologies. So let's say that to conclude, this suggests that understanding access to social protection requires to look closely at how specific eligibility rules interact with different forms of non-standard work. And this is particularly important in, of course, an increasingly diverse labor markets. I think that's next, but that's the last slide with, so that's the end of the presentation. Yeah. Thanks for your attention.
And thank you very, very much, Sylvia, for this presentation indeed. At this point, we are already arriving at the stage where we are ready to hear some of the comments that some of our guests will be able to bring. Our first commentator for today will be a member of the Cabinet of the European Commission, an Executive President for Social Rights and Skills, Quality Jobs and Preparedness, and a lecturer at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He has been previously serving as advisor to the Belgian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Social Affairs and Health, and has been an Associate Research Fellow at CEPS at the Center for European Policy Studies, a lecturer at the University of Milan, and at the Lille Catholic University. And I would like to welcome Francesco Corti.
Yes, no, thanks a lot. Thanks, colleagues. I'm very, first of all, very happy to be here. Olaf, I think indeed you nicely recalled when we submitted this project proposal quite some years ago. So I'm very happy to be here to comment both papers, yours and Sylvia's. No, let me maybe go in order and then with some more, I would say, more reflection on based on your findings. So I will start with yours, Olaf. I think first of all the findings are very important. Because you mentioned a little bit how much politicized is the debate on migration. And the thing that I appreciated the most of your paper is that the distinction between intra-EU and extra-EU, which is, I think, oftentimes forgotten in the sense that we have around 10 million people mobile within the EU. It's the eighth member states, I would say, in terms of size. But of course, the access to social security benefit, especially contributory benefit, but also non-contributory benefit, it's very different story. I think between intra-EU and extra-EU, and it's something I think that is very important in terms of policy implication. In the sense that what you observe is that there is indeed a better fiscal balance, let's say, or net fiscal effect compared to the native, and that's very important. But of course, it would worth also to stress in the policy reflection of the paper. I think the fact that when we talk about intra-EU, they're subject to very clear regulations. Not to mention the most important one, of course, which is the regulation on social security system coordination, which dates back 1957. And that, to a certain extent, is often linked to what you were mentioning, this discussion around welfare tourism. Why Romanian workers should get family benefit even if the kids are not in Germany but they're still in Romania or in Bulgaria. The same does not apply for migrant workers, for instance. They do not have access to the same benefit. So when I was reading the piece and now even more listening your presentation, I think that first of all it helps a lot in demystifying some ideas around migration, but I think you would really worth in your reflection in distinguishing between intra-EU more from a policy perspective, because they're really subject to all different types of rules, also in terms of exportability of their benefit, which of course is not captured in your analysis and cannot be captured. But this is to a certain extent something that is not a demerit of the paper. The paper is really good. I don't have, but it's just a policy reflection mine on how you can value furthermore, because what you would not capture and in your paper is to a certain extent the benefit, especially the contributory benefit to which intra-EU mobile workers have access to, but they're not. But since they go back to their country and they export the benefit, not least unemployment benefit, but also family benefit, sickness benefit. To a certain extent, this is not captured, but it's to a certain extent an important dimension, which would come with some maybe consideration that the net fiscal balance of extra EU migrants is even more positive to a certain extent. Even though for non-contributory benefit, as you explained. So I think it's my main comment is basically mostly on the broader policy implication in light of what are the entitlements that distinguish between intra-EU and non and extra-EU migrants. In the presentation, you don't have it, but it would be very, or you have it only aggregated. But it would be interesting to see if the net fiscal balance variation between member states changes depending if you distinguish between intra-EU and extra-EU. Because if you, maybe my bet, but maybe I'm wrong, would be that you would have a negative fiscal balance on Western countries, and maybe a more positive one for Eastern countries. So I don't know if you have done it. So basically, in the differentiation that you have between countries, if you disaggregate it by intra-EU and extra EU, but maybe I missed it. But anyway, just an interesting thing that I would be very happy to see what is the result on in that respect. So that would be basically my main comment to you, Olaf. I mean, let me see, because I took other notes on that because methodological wise is very sound. Sorry, I just scroll down my Word document. No, I would say that this is the main comments that I had for you. So on the policy perspective. Silvia, no, thanks a lot for your paper. It's very nice, and I liked it a lot because you recalled me the work of the Belgian presidency of 2 years ago, when we looked exactly of how to improve the Council recommendation on access to social protection or access to social security. Of course, your focus is specifically on the unemployment benefit. I think it's very good, and I also hear. I mean, I think the research focus on the 5 countries and 6 countries. Sorry, it's very good, so that you test different welfare model, and also the research design. It's good in how you look at the different dimension from contract length to working hours and employment status. Maybe to a certain extent, I think that the paper, because you focus a lot on the formal access or the legal access to unemployment benefit, which of course is one part of the story, which is very good. In looking at the different effect, direct or indirect, as you call them, and I think that works very well on the unemployment, on the eligibility. But of course, eligibility is one part of the story. No, I mean, of course that's the focus of the paper, and I will not say you need to change it. But of course, it came while reading to a certain extent an interest in looking at other dimension that may affect not the eligibility, but to a certain extent will ultimately affect the take up of the benefit, like the adequacy dimension, because of course they go hand in hand with the formal legal access to the benefit, but let's say the likelihood to take up a benefit will also depend. And as you say, the flexibility of contracts usually affect also the adequacy of the benefit ultimately, and to a certain extent is something that I think would highly enrich the analysis. And of course, in the council recommendation of 2019 or 18, there was the formal access, the effective access, the adequacy, and the transparency. You focus, of course, on the formal access, and that's, I think it's good, but to a certain extent the story it's partial, no, in your broader policy conclusion, and I think it would worth also broadening in that sense a little bit. I don't know if the analysis that would be, of course, ideal to look at non-standard employment and access to unemployment benefits, not only eligibility of unemployment benefit. One aspect that I think would worth in being also taken up, of course, non-standard employment comes with multiple employment contracts, which is also another aspect that I think would worth taking into account, meaning that sometimes you do not make up to an unemployment benefit, even though you combine different non-standard employment contracts. So that's maybe an aspect that would be interesting to take into account. Sorry, I just check if I'm following my notes. So I think that's all. The final maybe comment that I have is that the two papers would worth of joining forces at a certain point. in the sense that, of course, maybe here I'm biased by the ongoing negotiations on the revision of 883 on Social Security coordination system, where and specifically on the unemployment benefit chapter, which is one of the most contentious chapter. But indeed, the way also our European rules are designed at the moment. They are designed for a standard form of employment in terms of export. So the various principles of social security coordination at the European level, of course, are based on aggregation rules that would allow you not to lose social security contribution when exporting your benefit across the borders. So that's why I see a lot the link between what Silvia has written and what Olaf has done. But of course, these aggregation rules are conceived for standard form of employment. They were largely being conceived and designed for standard form of employment, while we know that in intra-EU mobility, we have an increasing number of also fragmented careers and non-standard form of contracts. There is a broader reflection. So this is just consideration that ignore, please, them if they are not relevant. But there is an increasing literature which I find very interesting, especially among lawyers on highly mobile workers in particular, and the capacity to export their social security benefit, because the more we witness non-standard form of employment in intra-EU labor mobility, which to a certain extent translate into lower take-up of especially unemployment benefit or other forms of social security contribution, that in my view will over time furthermore twist the balance in a more even positive net fiscal balance, as Olaf calls it, because people will not be able to export their social security right as they have been doing so far. So looking at the interplay between your two papers could be for the benefit of the overall project, something that can become just a policy brief or an op-ed, but it's quite interesting. So I stop it here because otherwise I take some time from Hilda, but I would like really to thank you a lot, because they're very nice and policy relevant contribution. Thanks.
Francesco Corti, thank you so very much for your analysis of these papers and for these contributions. At this point, I would have loved to invite Hilda Duri, who is the second of our scheduled panelists, to provide comments on the papers that we have just discussed. However, the realities of health are that she fell ill and that she is not able to join us for this event, for which she sends her apologies and her greetings. That being said, this is perhaps an opportunity to jump ahead and have a short conversation, the three of us that are here, over the papers, and a conversation that benefits, of course, from the fact that Francesco, you have worked with the project itself, which means that you are in the rather unique perspective of knowing the role of researcher for a European project such as TransEuroWorkS, having written the proposal, co-written the proposal yourself, and now being on the other side of the mirror, on the side of the European Commission, and knowing the realities of that. So I am curious, in terms of the realities of policymaking, you mentioned that those two papers would be a good foundation for a policy brief. What insights have you had now that you are at the Commission about kind of like what gets translated into policy from research that you perhaps didn't have in your earlier role?
No, but actually, in part, thanks. I think well, overall research. I mean, policy people in cabinet should read academic paper. Otherwise, it's difficult to do our job if you don't read what is the latest research. No. I mean, I think it's always difficult to translate the results. Let's put it in this way of the analysis that you do as a researcher into policy understandable terms, because to a certain extent, you as let's say when you're in the cabinet or as a policy officer, I see there are also other commission colleagues in the chat who may jump in, but of course you're focused on your sole policy initiative, and so it's difficult to see the broader spectrum. So in the cabinet, maybe you're a little bit luckier to see more policies. The translation can be of different nature. I mean, the findings of Olaf are very important because they demystify a myth of around welfare tourism that is quite present in the political discussion. But at the same time, especially when it comes to social security benefit, I mean that's something that is so much there and so much ungrounded on evidence. I may be now talking on the ongoing, as I said, review of Social Security coordination rules that we are having now, as so much politically heated this discussion that sometimes we forget about the underpinning numbers. So that's why the value of research is so important in getting really an idea of. I mean, we are having a lengthy discussion about activation measures. Because of course, if a migrant benefit of your social security system, you want to activate in a way that you want to make sure that it does not rely on this benefit, no, Olaf. And the problem sometimes is that we do not activate as strongly EU migrants or extra EU migrants as if we would activate our own native workers sometimes. Or what is important also to see is the scale. How many people are actually benefiting of this possibility? And is this a benefit within the country, or is it outside the country? I mean, I've been in a very, just as an anecdote, I've been in a absolutely surrealistic conversation 2 weeks ago in one member state, where I've been told that, of course, they are going to regularize undeclared work. And this will mean that more people will have access to unemployment benefit. And so we need to be attentive to extend the benefit to these EU migrants. Yes, of course, I fully agree. But at the same time, they were in undeclared work before, so they were not paying social security contribution as all. So I like a lot the concept of net fiscal balance of Olaf, because it grasped quite nicely. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking, Olaf, when I was reading your pieces was I would like even to isolate only social security contribution net of contributory benefit. So to have a calculation of the net fiscal balance only on social security contributions minus contributory benefit, because that would grasp the core of social security dimension, which is regulated at the European level, and will help us a lot in getting really an idea, is there really welfare tourism in Europe, or maybe it's just something that we do not witness, and that's something that I was thinking. But of course, I don't want to challenge the core of your variable, but it would be for the future very interesting to do such social security contribution minus contributory benefit, and see that net fiscal balance only on that, because that is subject to some rules, and then maybe seeing how does it apply only for intra-EU mobile workers or intra-EU migrants, as you call them. So, Andreas, to reply to your question, the research is simply very important. I mean, it's our also responsibility to read it and maybe to give some hints, but it's also a due balance between keeping the research. I mean, Olaf and colleagues, they were doing the project independently, and then yesterday when I read the paper, I thought it was useful for my work. I mean, but it's important to keep this independence on the one hand, and then to read it with the policy lenses, and maybe have a follow-up more targeted request or question. That's the delicate balance, I think, that we need to keep.
research that demystifies, research that provides new insights and sometimes counterintuitive insights. Silvia Ghirardi, you mentioned that in your own research, which was a comparative analysis to compare different countries' provision of social security benefits for non-standard employment. You mentioned that the differences do not follow welfare regimes patterns. And is there a way you could elaborate on that, and perhaps on the surprise and the challenge that lies in comparing, even within the EU, kind of like different approaches to social security?
Yeah, in fact, there was a result that kind of puzzled us, as you nicely pointed out, Andreas. But I think part of the answer boils back also to the points that Francesco has highlighted. So we look at legal access across these three dimensions, but there are other dimensions of social protection, of unemployment benefits that would be important to account for at the same time. So for instance, effective access, adequacy, and transparency. And if we look at, for instance, adequacy, we see that the welfare regime, so these 6 countries really follow kind of the welfare regime division. And it's very much into this rule of access. And I think to have an answer to your question and to really say, okay, in this case, it doesn't follow the traditional welfare regimes, but we should have a better picture with all these elements. So I think just based on this paper, we cannot say much more than the fact that this first result is puzzling, and I think it's worth to investigate further.
There is a saying that the most interesting thing that can be heard from a scientist is, that's strange. And in that sense, perhaps we have more interesting and useful research to look forward to on that front.
Yep.
I look forward to hearing from all of you again, well, from Olaf and from you, Silvia, again during our final panel. As a reminder to our audience, you are welcome to contribute with your own questions using the webinar's Q&A function. Our final panel will bring together most of the speakers that you will have heard in a larger conversation, and we will also do our best to answer those questions which will have come to you as well. We will, however, not be joined by Francesco Corti, whose duties take him elsewhere. Nonetheless, thank you very, very much, Francesco, for your support to this webinar, and we hope to hear from you again soon.
Thanks a lot to all of you. And actually, I've seen that Anton Emmerich is here between us. I could not see from my screen before, but I think that the question that you asked to me, you can ask to Anton, who used back in time a nice metaphor of the book on the shelf that is written, maybe a couple of years ago or maybe 10 years ago, like social investment. Then the policymaker picks it up. I think, Anton, that was your metaphor that you gave me a couple of years ago. Well, that's, I think, a good description of how the research should work. So thanks a lot. Thanks, Silvia and Olaf, for the paper, and Andreas for the nice moderation. So we keep in touch.
Certainly, with great pleasure.
Thank you very much, Andreas.
Bye-bye.
All right. This leaves us with a few minutes until our next panel, which I would recommend that you take to maybe stretch your legs, maybe grab a little something to drink in preparation. As a reminder, the results of the research that is being presented here is also going to be, or is in fact perhaps already available on the TransEuroWorkS website. To those of you who wish to learn more about the project and about our activities and our goals, feel free to look at the website, and we hope to find you again in a few minutes for our second panel on the public perception of home workers and social protection gaps. Until then, see you in a minute. And welcome back, everyone. We are now ready to move on to our second panel on the public perceptions of home workers and alternative forms of employment. To introduce the first of the two papers, and research findings covered in this panel. We are looking to a speaker who is the director of the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership and the Professor of Work and Employment at King's College London. She is a comparative labor market researcher with a focus on flexible working and home and remote working, future of work, and intersectional gender equality, with over 2 decades of experience of research and teaching, having worked with both national and international government agencies, with over 100 publications under her belt, including her recent book, The Flexibility Paradox, and the report Flexible Working Arrangements and Gender Equality in Europe. I would like you to welcome Hee-Jung Chung. I believe is...
Oh, no, it's working.
Ah, there we are.
My Teams is a bit funky today. It's probably because I'm
Absolutely.
sick. So yeah,
no
thank you
worries.
for inviting me. Yeah, I'm gonna whiz right through this because I thought I had 20 minutes, which I realized it's only 10. So yeah, do I take control of it? Can I take control of this, or do I need to tell
sure.
you to change slides?
No, you can take control of it. This is fine. Just
okay, great. So yeah, so home working, as you know, has risen quite tremendously over the pandemic, where only about like 1 out of 9 workers were working remotely on a regular basis, whereas that number goes up to almost 50% by pandemic. And that's especially true for certain countries like some Northern European countries, as well as the UK and Belgium. Despite this normalization of flexible working, we see that there are still quite a lot of what we consider flexibility stigma, so biased views against remote workers as they're not productive, they don't really work, etc., etc. So what this kind of work package or papers try to do is to understand why flexibility stigma exists and what kind of national context can explain for it. I'm going to skip this slide because of the lack of time, and I just want to kind of go into the main analysis. But what I really want to highlight here is that the bias against remote workers as being not productive or not as committed isn't really evidenced by science. That majority of the work around remote workers, commitment, motivation, but also productivity, finds that they're as effective as, if not, in fact, more productive than workers who work in the office, and mostly because they can save energy and time by not having to commute. And that it's largely due to the ideal workers culture. What that means is that in our today's culture, we're still under the assumption that the ideal worker is someone who can devote themselves to and only to work without any other responsibilities outside of work. And now that's quite important when we think about where does this bias lie most. So the idea is that, and this has been shown by some of the previous studies I've done, but also by other scholars as well, where the bias against the kind of assumptions around remote workers are not the same across organizations or across countries. Where there are stronger kind of ideal worker norms, you're bound to find more kind of bias against remote workers. But also when gender roles are more, let's say, regressive, there are also where bias against remote workers are stronger. This is largely because the ideal worker norm is inevitably embedded in this male breadwinner, that men are able to work because women, they have and devote themselves to work because they have a female partner who does all their caregiving work at home. And those things are also shaped by kind of family policy context. So generous family policies shape the norm about what is the norm of work-life balance, but also what is a good work culture. And also these supportive systems such as childcare leaves enable a better kind of boundary setting for workers so that they don't have to use remote workers for kind of work-life balance. Workers' bargaining position is also important because workers, when they have strong bargaining positions, they are able to protect against kind of any biases, but also able to use and take up these work-family arrangements without any negative repercussions, as well as social security systems. We're talking here employment protection legislation, but active passive labor market policies, mostly by kind of providing workers with employment security. And then finally, kind of labor market conditions. The supply and demand of workers have a huge influence over these biases because, you know, when supply is higher than demand, then obviously employers are more likely to have these biases, and that's what we're seeing right now with a lot of the return to office mandates. But then when there is less supply and demand's higher, then employers use these arrangements to try to lure in workers. So anyways, so going straight into the data and sample, I'm just assuming that people know this already, so I'm not gonna. So we're using the TransEuroWorkS survey data, and we have two. Oh, sorry about these. It's it looks a bit weird, but so we have two ways of measuring bias. So one is the explicit bias. So we asked through survey questions, like, so one is the personal attitude. So do you think people who work from home are generally less productive and less committed compared to people who go into the office? The second is normative expectations, which is, do you think working from home is negatively viewed by others? And this is kind of using Bicchieri's norms and the wild assumptions around the multidimensional norms, that my personal belief is different from what I think other people view, as well as what I think other people do. So the second one is about what other people think, especially managers. What do you think managers think? And then the third is, do they experience negative career outcomes? So those are three kind of different dimensions of norms we use. What is more, we also look at the what we call the implicit bias, which is essentially we serve kind of vignettes to show remote workers and to see how they are viewed by workers. So this is where we're trying to capture, let's say, the unconscious bias of people. And we vary by gender, parenthood, remote working practice, organizational practice, context, and, oh, we can't really see that, the organizational policy context. So these are the national variables. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I've mentioned it earlier, and we're doing an experiment, two-level, multi-level, or three-level, multi-level modeling. So what are the results? The results show that there are, in fact, kind of varying levels of stigma across countries. So this is the personal stigma. So as you can see, the highest levels of kind of, do I think remote workers are slackers, are found in countries like Slovakia, Greece, but also UK, Switzerland, and to some extent Italy. Whereas it's the Northern European countries, but as Germany, France, and strangely, like Spain really comes out as top in terms of, I personally don't believe that flexible workers or remote workers are less committed and productive. Now, second, if you're thinking about managers, that kind of changes quite a bit. And I think one of the biggest changes you see is like France and Spain, where like barely, I don't think so, but everybody thinks managers are really against these remote workers. Whereas, I mean, some of the countries that came out with the personal stigma don't necessarily come out as the highest levels of these managerial norms. Again, kind of just, you know, showing the distinction between them. But some countries like, you know, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Germany still has lower levels of both. UK, for example, have higher levels of both. And the third, again, is like, what do you think they experience? You know, bad career outcomes. Again, France, UK come out quite high, as well as Greece, Italy, Switzerland, etc. Now, so who has these assumptions? And these are very many numbers that I'm not going to go into too much details about everything, but what I will highlight is a couple of things. So we want to look at if there are, it's like if there's a certain group, especially with regards to demographic. And what you find is that it is the fathers who have high levels of stigma across all three different dimensions of stigma. And it is women in general, but especially childless women more than even mothers, although that that difference is probably not as significant as the other things that have lower levels of stigma. Again, mothers and, well, women especially, is because they are likely to be the users of these arrangements and more proponents of it, so the people that they want to be likely to want to do it. Strangely enough, tertiary education workers are less likely to hold stigma, but ooh. And okay, so sectoral variation is like people who tend to use a lot of flexible working perhaps have lower levels. But most importantly here, I think the one of the key things to show is that, I mean, we've had the reference as armed forces, but I think what you could also see is the managers. It's the managers who hold a lot of this stigma compared to some of the other groups that might be using these arrangements. I'm going to kind of, like, this will be probably one of my last slides. So what are explaining it? And as expected, countries with generous family policies, such as childcare policies, but also strong unions, such as collective bargaining coverage, or countries with like long hours work culture, which is kind of, we're measured here by long hours work, and share of workers who work very long hours are one of the highest explain these variation most. And interestingly enough, when we look at the three different biases, it's the personal bias that we can explain, but not so much the normative and behavioral bias, which means there's something else happening there that we're not able to capture. And the final thing I want to say is that of the variables, the one that really explains this, all three types, is the long hours work culture. So whether or not people are generally working long hours in the country. I'm just going to skip through this, which is like the implicit bias. So when we look at biases, that is at the unconscious, the picture is much more complex, where Denmark comes out as a weird one. So one key conclusion is that despite this whole idea of flexible working being normalized, remote working being normalized, it is still very much biased. There's a lot of bias against remote workers, and this is a problem because we know that when such biases exist, workers tend to have to feel like they have to work harder and longer, and we're seeing this in terms of digital presenteeism, that workers are not actually being productive, but trying to perform productivity through other means, which is bad for not only well-being, but also their productivity. So it's bad for companies as well, and it also leads to bad well-being outcomes, which is going to cost society quite a bit. National contexts do matter, but especially for the personal bias. So this needs a little bit more kind of exploration, and again, an implicit bias exists everywhere. But if we were to try to remove some of these biases, one of the things we need to do is we can't just introduce these policies alone. We need to kind of think about what kind of work cultures do we have, and what ways in which we can address these, very long-standing ideal worker cultures, and how can we embed in culture better work-life balance culture across countries. So I'm going to end it there. So, yeah.
Thank you so very much, Hee-jung, and thank you for joining us in spite of kind of like your current health situation, which our deepest sympathies, hoping that you get well soon. Taking over once more the presentation and returning to our next speaker, who will follow up on what we have just heard. One moment. Where were we? Just here. Our next speaker, who is ordinary professor at the University of Geneva, and whose academic trajectory started in Amherst College and then a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. A teaching position at Cornell University and at Princeton University prior to moving to Geneva, but as well visiting scholarship at Nuffield College, Oxford, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Social Sciences, the Russell Sage Foundation, Sciences Po Paris, and the Hertie School of Governments in Berlin. With a long-standing interest in the comparative politics of inequality and redistribution, as well as an emphasis on labor market dynamics and the role of trade unions, our next contributor has written extensively on the Swedish social democracy and also contributed to literature on the varieties of capitalism, with current research dealing with two topics, namely the politics of growth models and political inequality in liberal democracies. Please welcome Jonas Pontusson.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk I'm going to talk about social protection gaps, and that overlaps a lot with what Sylvia talked about earlier. And I'm going to draw on the public opinion survey that we all ran as part of the Horizon project, so which is what Hee-Jung just spoke about. So I am I'm connecting to both of those papers. My part of the Horizon project is on non-standard unemployment and its implications for welfare states in general. I think there's an extensive literature that tells us that we have had a big increase since the 1980s of fixed-term employment, part-time employment, temp agency work, and other kinds of what we might call bogus self-employment. The literature tells us that non-standard workers earn less, certainly on an annual basis. They are more exposed to unemployment. Their career prospects are not as good as those of full-time workers with indefinite contracts. And also, we've heard from Sylvia, and there's lots of studies to back this up, about social protection gaps and that they don't have the same access to social insurance benefits, sick pay, as well as unemployment. We know a lot less about whether people perceive these differences, who perceives them, and whether they matter politically or not. So that's the objective of my thing. And the framing then is the following. Is there a fundamental political cleavage between labor market insiders and outsiders? And I'm a political scientist, and among political scientists, there was a large literature 10, 15 years ago that posited such a fundamental cleavage. Insiders, people with secure jobs, working full-time, according to this literature, were primarily interested or are primarily interested in employment protection and are not terribly interested in passive labor market policies, unemployment compensation, or active labor market policies that typically target the outsiders. And in addition, this literature told us that political decision makers, for all kinds of reasons, primarily cater to insiders. They're more likely to be citizens. They're more likely to vote. They are more likely to be politically influential. The alternative, I think, which we are going to see some evidence, or I'm going to present you some evidence for, is that what we might call this the normalization of non-standard employment. Actually, over the last 10, 15 years, fixed-term employment, part-time employment hasn't increased that much, but many more people seem to have had experiences of non-standard employment at some point in their career trajectory. And that the divide between outsiders and insiders is no longer perhaps as clear as it once was. Insiders worry about becoming outsiders, and there are at least some outsiders who think that they might become insiders. So perhaps the divergence of political preferences or policy preferences is not as strong as it was thought to be 10 or 15 years ago. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you some evidence from this survey that we did, 15 countries, and in contrast to Hee-Jung, I'm not going to show you any regression results. There are regression results in the paper, but I'm basically just going to show you some descriptive data, which I think is interesting. First thing to be noted is that all of the data I will show you is based on working age respondents aged 18 to 65. And then we're going to sort them into different kinds of employment profiles. Next slide, please. So this is the distribution of working age survey respondents by country, and we sort them into people with full-time and working full-time on an indefinite contract, people working part-time, that is to say 15 to 30 hours on an indefinite contract, people having fixed-term employment contracts, regardless of the number of hours they work. Then we have a category called non-standard employment precarious, which are people who say they're dependent employees, but also say that they don't have an employment contract, or they say that their employment contract doesn't guarantee hours, or they work for a temp agency, or they work less than 15 hours, on average less than 15 hours a week, which marginal part-timers, if you wish. Then we have the self-employed. We have unemployed people who had a permanent job, and unemployed people who had a non-standard job, and out is the home minders, the students, and the early retirees, people who are no longer in the labor force. Next slide. So first, about perceptions of working conditions. So we asked a question, or a set of questions, about whether people thought that people with fixed-term contracts and part-time workers, whether they had, in terms of pay, that was one question, in terms of influence at work, second question, and the third about employment prospects, whether people thought that the conditions of these non-standard workers were worse, the same, or better than those of permanent full-time workers. And here you see the answers, the distribution of answers for the standard and the non-standard workers. And as you can see there, I think, so higher values here means that you think that fixed-term and part-time workers are worse off. 0 means that you think their working conditions or employment conditions are the same. And as you will see, as you can see there, I think, so the ratios there are the ratio of those who have a value above 0 to those who have a value below 0. And the interesting thing, I think, is that permanent full-time workers are more aware of the differences in employment conditions than non-standard workers are. Non-standard workers seem to be not as aware of the advantages of having a full-time indefinite job, perhaps are less bothered by it, or not expecting to have that for themselves. So that's our first finding. The second question, next slide, please. Then we asked people about their perceived access to social benefits. We specifically mention unemployment benefits and sick pay insurance relative to workers in other kinds of employment contracts. Are they worse? Your condition, your access, is it worse? Is it the same, or is it better? And here, higher values on the ratio mean that you think you have better conditions than others. And here we see clearly that the non-standard workers are much more aware. These are, I can show you the regression results. These are statistically significant differences. Non-standard workers are much more likely to think that they have poor access, relatively speaking, poor access to social benefits. And I take away from that at least non-standard workers
Jonas, you have muted yourself.
I beg your pardon. Non-standard workers tend to be more bothered or more aware of being poorly treated by the state than they are aware and bothered by being poorly treated by employers. And I can tell you about why we think that is so, but I'm going to skip that and move right along. Time is of the essence. Next slide, please. Oh, two things that come out in the regression analysis, which I think is interesting. We can separate out people who currently have a permanent job full-time, but had a non-standard job sometime over the last 12 months. And similarly, we can look at people who are downwardly mobile, that is to say, they had a permanent job and now they're a non-standard worker. Non-standard workers who held a permanent job and are now in a non-standard situation, they tend to evaluate standard employment more negatively, and they think that their access to benefits is relatively poor. By contrast, non-standard workers who moved up tend to be more positive about non-standard work. There is a miswriting there on the slide, I think, but having had a non-standard job and it became a stepping stone for them, they think non-standard jobs are not necessarily so bad. Next slide. So then we asked about policy preferences, and we presented respondents with a couple of hypothetical parties. And we said, here is a party that is advocating as a main feature of their platform the extension of social benefits to non-standard workers or to insecure workers. And then we had a second question which said, here is a hypothetical party that is proposing to re-regulate fixed-term employment, making it harder or less possible for employers to employ people on fixed-term contracts. Would you be more likely, less likely, or would it make no difference to your propensity to vote for this party? And I show the results by country here for all working age respondents. And as you can see, there is a lot of support for extending social benefits to non-standard workers. More than in most countries, more than at least more than 40%, and are more likely to vote. The net support, that is to say, the difference between more likely and less likely to vote for this party, is consistently higher than 20% difference or something for non-social insurance, and a little lower or noticeably lower for restrictions on fixed-term contracts. And I take that to mean that people are the principle that everyone should have access to unemployment insurance and sick pay insurance is a more popular principle than the principle that everyone ought to have a job with an indefinite contract. But strong support. People perceive these, people like the idea of addressing these inequalities, I think. Next slide, please. And I'm guessing that I'm out of time, but Andreas is very gentle, so he will let me speak for 2 more minutes. This is net support, or this is the same thing now only for social insurance benefits. And by country, we've sorted people into either permanent full-time workers or non-standard workers or others. And others now includes the self-employed and the part-time. And as you can see, even among full-time workers with indefinite contracts, net support consistently, it varies across countries, but it is consistently positive and quite significantly positive. And in some countries, full-time workers on indefinite contracts, this is true for Greece, for instance, they're actually just as likely to support equal access to social benefits as non-standard workers are. Next slide, please. Just 2 things. Perceptions of one's own relative access to social benefits is associated with support for these inclusive reforms. And interestingly, I think if you're a standard worker, a full-time permanent worker in an occupation where there are a lot of non-standard workers, this makes you more likely to support inclusive reforms. Next slide, please. So I take this to mean that insiders actually care about the non-standard problem. And if it is the case, as I think it is the case, that governments have not done a heck of a lot to introduce these kinds of inclusive reforms, it's not because insiders are opposed to it. It must have something to do with budgetary constraints or something like that. That said, I do find, and this graph is supposed to illustrate this, that there is actually if we look at net insider support for inclusive social policy reforms, there is a cross-national correlation between net insider support and the generosity of unemployment benefits. Italy is a bit of an outlier here, but in general, net support among insiders for inclusive reforms is lower in countries that have more generous unemployment benefits. And I will try to talk about this more in the paper, but I think generous benefits makes it less, you moved your slide too quickly. Generous benefits makes insiders less worried about becoming outsiders. They have more time to look for a job that is the kind of job they expect. And they're also probably concerned about the costs of extending access. The more generous the benefits are, the implication will be that if everybody has access to the same benefits as I do, somebody's gonna have to pay for this. Last slide. Very quickly then, my next step, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to finance this, but I think I see a path, is a survey experiment, which we should have had in the Horizon survey, but I hadn't thought of it yet, when you are asking people, not only do you think non-standard workers should have equal access, but how do you think that equal access, or you would present people with different ways of financing that equal access. Average benefits for everybody could be reduced. I doubt that people will like that. Deficit spending could be served to finance this. Taxes on everyone could be increased, or taxes on the affluent, the wealthy, could be increased. And my numbering is off there, but I'm going to bet my house on the idea that the most popular reform is going to be taxing the affluent to finance the extension of social benefits to non-standard workers. I'm done.
All right, then. Thank you so very much, Jonas. Moving on to the to the comment part of the panel, we welcome the first of our two commentators, who is a Belgian policy officer in the Gender Equality Unit of the European Commission, where she focuses on the economic empowerment of women, including work-life balance and care, as well as on the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. She has previously worked on the working conditions team in Eurofound, meaning that she has ties to the second of our two commentators, where she was responsible for sustainable work over the life course and worked on the European Working Conditions Survey. And she has also worked on social protection issues for the Belgian presidency of the EU and in the European Commission. Please welcome Greet Vermeulen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very interesting seminar today. I think it's so important for policymakers to listen to research and research results. It's really very interesting to reflect on what could be the messages for us that we need to take out of it, and to be faced with a little bit of a mirror and a kind of an in-depth kind of analysis of those things. I think your research findings put the issues in a larger context, and they really point to give a first understanding of the driving factors which are behind certain behaviors, which are often for policymakers not that easy to understand, and differences across the EU and across different actors within the member states. And they help to debunk some of the gender stereotypes and other myths there are between different workers and their behaviors, as well as employers and company structures. And they highlight the importance of work culture in for policymakers, as well as different sectoral, occupational, and workplace practices, which make a very big difference in whether things work or not work. I work in the European Commission at the moment in the Gender Equality Unit, and I'm going to mostly talk about Hee-jung's paper, which is a very important element of some measures we took in the context of the previous gender equality strategy with the Work-Life Balance Directive, in which there is a specific measure not only to promote paternity leave, parental leave, and carers leave, but also flexible working time arrangements, including part-time work, flexi time, but also remote work, which as Hee-jung already explained, was really picked up right after we had kind of the Work-Life Balance Directive was approved, kind of really was implemented directly during the COVID time in all member states, but now has kind of not completely stabilized in all countries and has seen some changes. And I think it's also important to reflect on these differences for gender equality in the context of the whole EU agenda, where competitiveness is one of the big drivers and where we are aiming for high employment rates, for which we need both men and women in the work practices, and where we have also agreed, where the member states have agreed to also tackle to halve the gender employment gap. Most of our policy measures target member states, and this is where it often comes to some of the issues where it's very difficult to really regulate what kind of differences between workplaces, what HR managers should do, etc. But it's really key to understand also what drives and what are some of the differences in order to tackle them indirectly and to promote those kind of things. All member states have now implemented the Work-Life Balance Directive, but we are currently looking at how they have implemented it and trying to understand what are some of the issues still in the member states, maybe kind of start court cases against some who have not implemented it well, but then also to try and understand what are the issues to do next and what are the elements to tackle further in order to kind of keep on promoting workplace practices and work-life balance for women and men. The whole idea behind the Work-Life Balance Directive was very much to try and promote equal sharing of care between women and men. Before this directive, the EU really was focusing taking care as something for women with the maternity leave directive, which was very, very important. But we kind of swapped it and kind of say work-life balance is something which is for both women and men, and in this case for women and men with care responsibilities. I think we should go broader, but that's an issue which I will talk about later. But I think with the Work-Life Balance Directive, we kind of really made this change in order to say we really are trying to encourage men also to kind of make use of family leaves and flexible working time arrangements in order to allow for better reconciliation. And we know when men take paternity leave, there is also a bigger chance that they take parental leave, often still in lesser degree than women, but I think there's also a bigger chance that they might also go for flexible working time arrangements. And it goes hand in hand with something which also was pointed out by Hee-jung, the importance of having affordable, accessible, and quality care services, early childhood education and care, for which we adopted we had adopted the European care strategy with a council which was flanked by a proposal for a council recommendation, which was adopted a couple of months later in December 22 on Barcelona targets for participation of children in early childhood education and care. And I really think it's a very important element, because those elements, they're two sides of a coin, and those member states that have high participation rates of children in early childhood education and care, that have really invested in care services, they often also see that there is more take-up of family-friendly workplace practices. So it means that you have more men and women kind of reconciling work with flexible, well, kind of work with care responsibilities over the life course. And I think it's a very important element. I was a couple of months ago in a seminar with Nordic ministers, and they were kind of highlighting really this choice they made to invest in family-friendly kind of family-friendly workplaces, and including both with care services and flexible kind of sharing of care between parents. And they said it was a very deliberate choice, which helped also to keep our companies to keep our economies fit. So coming now to what we are doing at the moment. Last year at International Women's Day, we adopted a roadmap for women's rights in which we kind of paved the big principles, what we need to do for gender equality, and work-life balance and care is one of the really important elements in there, where we kind of say we should promote equal sharing of care responsibilities between women and men, promote working conditions that facilitate reconciliation between private, family, and working life, have widespread access to flexible working arrangements for all, and encourage fathers to make use of paternity and family leaves, and ensure affordable and accessible early childhood education and care, and also long-term care. And also kind of look at the care sector and quality jobs in the care sector. That's this a couple of a month ago, actually now, we adopted the European Care Strategy, which kind of paves, lays out the plan, our work plan for the coming years. And I think one of the key elements in there is that we need to continue tackling these gender stereotypes. With regard to work-life balance, we do have a number of actions in there. We will do some implementation dialogues on the Barcelona targets on the early childhood education and care, where we will discuss with member states what are some of the issues, member states, but also other policy actors, social partners, NGOs, etc. What are some of the elements that need to be done? We will also have a discussion with the member states to reflect very much on what are the issues with how can they encourage better uptake of the rights to family leaves by men, and what are some of the shortcomings. Maybe it is the payment, which has in the directive, the agreement was adequate pay. Maybe it's the payment. Maybe there are other elements which could help to encourage men to make more use of it, and to also kind of further understand how can we tackle these persistent gender stereotypes among them. We will also work on a European care deal, which will focus more on the working conditions of those working in the care sector, but which is also a very important element to ensure quality of care services. So to instill trust upon those who make use of these care services as well as this is also important from a gender equality perspective, because so far still the majority of workers in the care sectors are women. We hope also to attract more men to the care sector. I think again, this is a bigger discussion which needs to be done. And then we will work on two reports, one on the Work-Life Balance Directive and one on the Barcelona directives, which will come, which we will do as well. But how can we go further? Sorry, I'm going to quickly go to the last bit. I think how can we continue working with citizens, with companies, with actors in the field to tackle these stereotypes with regard to care. We've just published a call under the Citizenship, Equalities, Rights and Values program, where kind of actors, preferably cross country, can make proposals for projects in order to tackle good kind of test good practices or approaches in order to tackle a number of issues around this. The deadline for this call is the 28th of April. There are a number of actions which I think are very relevant to what we are discussing today. The first one is to promote family-friendly practices among employers in the private and in the public sector, to encourage take-up of the rights, including telework and hybrid working, and flexible working hours or other forms of sharing work. The second one is also an element, I think, which is one of the issues why there is reluctance to go for remote working, is the prevention and protection of any form of unfavorable treatment for those workers who make use of their rights under the directive, which is either the uptake of leave, but also if you go into remote working. I fully understand that it's very difficult to promote, to kind of really and show that as a remote worker you're worse treated. You really need to have very clear cases, but I think it is important to reflect upon what kind of measures could be taken there. And I think maybe work with HR managers would be important, at least to make them aware of some of these elements. And then to promote the equal sharing of unpaid work among workers, to include encouraging men to make use of their rights as well, and then the value of paid care work, but that's more for the care sector itself. So that's some of the issues we are doing at EU level, but I think what we've heard today, I think for me is a very, very important one. I think the difference across countries and the cultures are very, very important to keep on reflecting on what's behind it, and to maybe keep on talking about what are some of the gender stereotypes, what are some of the hindrances, why some managers are much more reluctant and are not trustful of workers who work from home, even if research shows clearly that there is no big difference. So I think it is very important to keep this dialogue open and to keep on exchanging with each other to try and understand what are the lessons we can learn. And I'm looking forward to continuing listening to the discussion and then to further results from the project. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your contributions, and I think we all look forward to hearing your further comments and maybe an elaboration on this topic in the final panel. But before we do so, we do have one more speaker joining us, a senior research manager in the social policies unit at Eurofound, whose research topic includes social protection and its digitalization, housing, care services, mental health, and the socioeconomic impacts of the green transition. Prior to joining Eurofound, he was assistant professor at Kościuszko University in Warsaw, having completed a PhD in business administration and management at Università Bocconi in Milan, after working as a research officer at the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies in Madrid. Please welcome Hans Dubois.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the extensive introduction. And also that was really interesting also to hear from Geet what the EU is doing, very clearly explained. Thank you. So I just wanted to say that Eurofound has written a report on telework, on its negative and positive aspects in terms of work-life balance, social interaction, and also in terms of overtime. Now, this information on remote working stigma clearly fills a gap. It's really, really useful filling this gap. And it's not only uncovering the aspects of stigma itself, but also delves into the heterogeneity in which it is applied. So that's really useful. I think when thinking about these results, it's also really important to keep thinking about the background, that there's really big inequalities in the ability to telework and in the working conditions while teleworking. So looking at the heterogeneity again. Partly relating to what has been said, but also, of course, there's jobs which are more teleworkable than others. For instance, I'm at the moment writing a report about care services, where women are overrepresented, as Greet already said, and there's telework is really not an option most of the time. So that's important to keep always in the background in one's head. And then other issue in terms of the ability to telework and the quality of the telework, which is, I think, often overlooked, is what we looked at in our report on unaffordable and inadequate housing. And that's what we called in that report, like our homes teleworkable. So you see that in general, after the pandemic, there was an increase in the importance people attach to the various dimensions of quality of their home, such as whether there's noise in the home, for instance. And of course, there are groups, low-income groups, which live in homes which are not really convenient for teleworking. And that's an access to teleworkable homes, I think, is another dimension which is often overlooked. So that's what I wanted to say about basically the first presentation. So it's extremely interesting and relevant, and just to highlight some points about the background. And then Jonas' presentation, that's also fascinating. It also feels clearly an important gap. It's mapping these perceptions. I would really be interested also in if there's a follow-up study to know the reasons why people hold these perceptions. That would be really, really interesting as well. And it relates a bit to the issue of in the labor force survey, there's a question about why people work part-time. And then, a part says that because no full-time job was found. So that's usually called as involuntary part-time work. But there's also many people who say they're caring for adults or for children, and that's the reason why they are working part-time. That's the care sector, again, where I'm looking at the moment. Part-time work is incredibly common. And while the reasons are similar to other sectors, it's more relevant because it's so common, part-time work. So in an earlier report on access to care services, where we look less at the working conditions survey or the working conditions issues, as in this report, we look more at the access side. We challenge a little bit the idea of involuntary and voluntary part-time work in the context of care use. So people report, we don't need access to long-term care or child care because somebody in the household is already doing that, or a relative is already doing that. Now, this is usually referred to as a voluntary reason to work part-time. Well, I would challenge this concept of voluntarism. Sometimes it's strongly driven by cultural norms, which may not always be so voluntarily for the person involved, and so I think this relates to it, like whether you can it relates a bit to paternalism also with the point about whether people feel like they're worse off by being not so well protected or covered by social protection. Then I wanted to mention that so Sylvia in the previous part of the webinar very elegantly showed differences in contractual flexibility among these 5 EU member states in the UK. Now we looked also at other countries in our report on social protection 2.0. And I found similar results also for other countries. And we see that for part-time work, for instance, it's people who have been working part-time. For instance, we have examples from Poland, Finland, Austria, mini-jobbers in Germany as well, by the way, that the top-ups from not the higher tier unemployment benefits are important, but the lower tier ones. So these are income-tested unemployment schemes or other benefits. And we see that in practice, minimum income schemes are actually covering many people in these, who have been working part-time, for instance. And that, relates to the final larger comments. I had some smaller ones, but there's a lot of focus on atypical jobs, and it's important to follow this, in particular where it concerns new forms of employment, because of course there need to be rules developed. But in practice, there are many vulnerabilities among people with standard jobs as well. For instance, people with full-time indefinite contracts but very low wages. In 22 member states, higher tier unemployment benefits are proportion to prior income and are extremely low for these people. There are also many gaps and inequality or inadequacies for the rest. So, for instance, about 2/3 of unemployed people in the EU do not receive benefits because unemployment benefits because their unemployment records were shorter than required, or just their benefits have run out. In 18 member states, in Italy, one of the schemes, actually after 1 year, the employment benefit has run out, and in many much before. And in many member states, like in 14 member states, the proportion of your previous, of the reference amount or of your previous salary decreases in time. So actually after 3 months already, you receive really little. Now the caps of these amounts can be really low. So in practice, there are several countries where at most you receive as an unemployment benefit 40% of the national average wage. Then I think Francesco said already something about non-take-up. So just to say that it's important to, while focusing on these kind of atypical situations, it's also important to keep in mind that in practice, many people rely on minimum income schemes anyways, and the unemployment benefit only are for a few months really, much more or considerably more for that, only for a very small group actually. The higher wage earners. Then we are looking at the moment in the care sector at a very non-standard, highly female and highly migrant subsection of work, and that's domestic care, where the employer is the household. Now, that's not always a new forms of employment, a very old one actually, but there are measures taking place which try to better capture this group, such as better collective bargaining, which is for personal assistance in Finland, and also financial schemes, so paying part of the unemployment insurance, like in Spain, by the state, so it becomes more attractive to declare employment, or legal enforcement, like in Portugal. Now, just to say, lastly, we in particular look at an emerging type of care work, still pretty small, but it's really important to be vigilant of this because this does require new rules, etc. And that's platform care work. We see that in very short time, we map in all the member states altogether 150 platforms offering childcare or long-term care. And we see that only 22% of these employ the worker. The rest is employed by the household, either as a self-employed worker or undeclared. So yeah, that was a last note I wanted to say about a particular non-standard type of employment, where it's really good to remain vigilant.
All right then, Hans, thank you so much for your contribution once more. We have about 10 minutes until our next general discussion, so I would invite you once more to use this time to refresh yourself, stretch your legs, hydrate if necessary, and we shall rejoin the rest of our panelists for a general discussion at 10 to 4 p.m. See you in a moment. And welcome back, everyone. As we now approach the final panel discussion, which will gather those of our panelists that were able to remain in a conversation which will bring all of them together, I would like to start by introducing one of our last two panelists for the day, a professor of political science and sociology at the Department of Political and Social Sciences of the European University Institute. He has been trained as an economist at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, taking his doctorate from the University of Oxford, and has served as Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where he founded the Amsterdam Center for Contemporary European Studies. He's also directed the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy, and between 2014 and 2017 was Centennial Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Most recently, he was a member of the European Commission's newly formed high-level group on the future of social protection and of the welfare state in Europe, which published its report this year. And he is here today to give us his thoughts. Please welcome Anton Hemmerich.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the papers that I read with great pleasure. I'm gonna sort of go through them, raising a number of questions, or rather, puzzles that I'd like to share with you, and then maybe we have a conversation about that. I mean, fundamentally, all papers are very good in sort of debunking received knowledge, right? Olaf's point about migrants are not per se a drain on the public purse. I mean, everyone is a drain on the public purse, but migrants less so than natives. I mean, it's really a puzzling finding. I mean, one question I would have is, many of these migrants are workers, right? And these workers grow old, and maybe then, they haven't built up a lot of pensions, and then they may still be eligible for social assistance, and thereby which they become a drain on the public purse, if you want to see it that way. But overall, the message is, migration, immigration is not a bad thing per se. When it comes to home working stigma, and here I take a little bit more of a developmental perspective, I mean, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Spain are basically leading the pack towards, there is really no need for this kind of stigma, and then some other countries are following in behind, and many of these countries, such as Slovakia, Greece, and maybe Poland, actually, it's not so much a culture of working long hours, but maybe a necessity of working long hours to make ends meet for the family. So I kind of wonder here, what is the relationship between structure and culture and labor regulation? And that was also Sylvia's contribution. I mean, here again, you see this general trend, I would say. I mean, it's a bit of an old term that Jonas used to say maybe there's a normalization going on of non-standard, normalization of non-standard employment. And then what would that look like? I mean, then you have regulation, but you also have the idea that there are benefits at the end of the day. So to see that the UK is on top makes me wonder, what is the adequacy of the benefit compared to, let's say, Denmark Sweden. But again, the general trend is yes, there is more non-standard employment, and it's important to think about how can we normalize this with every hour worked you pay into social contribution, you pay into social security, you save for your pensions and things like that. And that is more or less the policy development that we see everywhere, and in particular also that Greet emphasized very strongly on gender and work-life balance. And then Jonas' contribution, again, sort of, the normalization of non-standard employment, also the phrase he used to think about, sometimes a non-standard job could be a stepping stone to, advance a career, whether this is standard or not. And this very important finding that in general, that there is more support for inclusive social protection in a world where non-standard employment has become more normal, and this brings us back to this sort of the literature that is very dominant, and Jonas used it also to a great extent, of that there is dualization, which I kind of never really believed, because I mean, if there is no social protection, if there's no social security, your social security is in your job. So to defend a job protection where there is no buffer beyond the job, comes naturally. And I think this did happen in the 1980s and 1990s, but that period has long gone. Most part-time workers now are also somehow protected by social protection, pensions, social assistance, and also unemployment benefits. So it's the literature, the academic literature on dualization, and also the literature on making this trade-off between social investment and social consumption or social protection that is really at fault with the new trends. And again, what I see is a developmental trajectory here of a more positive understanding of migration, normalization of homework, more flexicurity, and it reminds me a little bit of work that I recently do. I do it every 2 years for the Bertelsmann Foundation, and I have to go through a number of countries, 30 in total of the OECD, to see what has happened over the past couple of years when it comes to family policy, pensions, active labor market policy, preventive health, inclusive social protection, and also there, the general trend is more inclusive social protection, a stronger emphasis over time on preventative health care, more carrots than sticks to raise the retirement age in order to respond to demographic aging, and a very strong emphasis on dual earner family policy. Of course, there are basket cases, there are outliers to this general trend, but these are a small minority. It's Hungary, the US, Slovakia, and Israel, in the stuff that I've done for the Bertelsmann Foundation. So in a way, the story is a positive one. Now, that's not all that true, because we also know, and this is something that the Bertelsmann Foundation also does, what they find in terms of democracy and governance and rule of law, there is backsliding. So at the time when there is incremental progress on, let's call it social investment for lack of a better word, there is this sort of political backsliding, and this kind of raises a very fundamental puzzle that what we see especially in Europe is a sort of how would I call it, an ongoing resilient social democratic policy evolution. Whereas at the same time, we see political backsliding and in a way the decline of social democracy. So how do we explain this ongoing social democratic policy evolution without social democracy? There's something like an eigendynamiek or a self-transformative quality to the welfare state that doesn't rely on social democracy, except for whatever happens with economic political backsliding. Because here we see again the examples of Israel, the US, Slovakia, and Hungary. I mean, at the end of the day, they do turn against this trend. So somehow, we're running politically, I would say, we're running into a cul-de-sac. And that just, so my question to Olaf and to Sylvia and Jonas and all the others in the room is basically, what is going on right now in terms of, there are these policy developments, there are the politics is lacking, and where does this end? And or maybe better still, where did we go wrong? Because somehow social democracy has sort of, maybe it's been too successful, that it should have run into extinction because of generating this eigendynamiek. Anyway, this is my sort of pitch for the discussion. I don't have an answer. I'm just pointing to a number of questions that I would like to discuss with all of you. Thank you so much.
Anton Hemrich, thank you so much for your contribution. The last but not least, we have one more speaker to introduce to you, a senior researcher at the European Trade Union Institute with degrees in political science and social policy analysis from the University of Antwerp and the KUL. He gained a doctorate at the Institute for Social and Economic Research, University of Essex, in applied social and economic research, and worked as a postdoctoral researcher on a European project, Growth, Equal Opportunities, Migration in the Market, before working at the OCDE in the Employment, Labour and Social Affairs Directorate, carrying out research on wage equality and productivity. Please welcome Wouter Swijsen.
Good afternoon, possibly at least, but very happy to be in this nice company and contribute to this really interesting discussion. So I'm currently working at the European Trade Union Institute, a research center in Brussels, where I mainly work on labor market trends and policies. And I see my slides have become much prettier than when I sent them. Thank you very much, Andreas. So will you move them, or can I? If I move them, can you see them?
I'll take care of them, if that's all right.
Of course, that's all right. Thank you very much. That's a very nice treatment. So I also just wanted to give a bit of my thoughts and link it to research I've done where I know a bit more on, to provide some context and shape the debate a little bit. But I wanted to start with, could you go to the first slide, please, Andreas? I want to start with really thanking you all for the really interesting work. I think the project is super interesting. I thought it was very relevant to read the degree of nuance that was given, which I really enjoyed. Is it possible to go to the slide? Or shall I?
I think it should already be displayed.
Possibly, not for me.
Can everyone already see the slide?
Well, it should be a slide that starts with thank you.
Yes.
Okay. You can all see it?
I can see it.
Then I need to navigate on my own as well. This is a complicated system. Okay. So just to say, I thought it was super interesting to see the degree of detail and heterogeneity shown, and the nuance brought, because I think far too often we discuss these issues a bit at the more abstract European level, but I think it's quite important and relevant to also delve a bit deeper down. And I think that was very clear and interesting with the work on the bias or views on teleworking and working from home, this variation across the member states. Same with the costs of migrant, net fiscal position, and the variation in how non-standard work particularly is linked to the welfare state. I think it's really quite important and interesting to go down into the details here. I think it's also very nice and relevant to have this wide variety of topics linked together on how the welfare state is changing with the future of work. So then we go one slide further to migration and mobility. I will go on the three main topics based on the interesting papers and try to give a bit of my perspective and see if this might be relevant for some of the discussion. So in reading the paper on the net fiscal position, I had to think a lot about the discussions of migration paradox, where there is this huge political debate, relatively negative sentiment towards migration, combined with demographic and labor shortage needs for greater migration, and that really point to a need to keep migration going. And I think in reading through the paper, I was thinking the key pathway there is really the extent to which migrants face hurdles to work or are encouraged to join the labor market. I think also the points Anton made about looking over the life course are quite interesting for the longer term, and there will be huge variations between types of migrants depending on whether they stay in the country of residence, whether they move back. Big variation between intra-EU movers and third country nationals as well, which I think Francesco already mentioned in the first discussion. So what I wanted to link it to is some of the research showing the variation in getting people to work, particularly with third country migrants. There's this huge variation between people depending on the motivations and the pathways through which they enter, with particularly non-economic migrants really facing disadvantage, less likely to work, often not having their qualifications recognized. So this was really clearly pointed out by Olaf in the work, and that probably has to do with the fact that there's no real, that probably is behind the fact there's no real gradient by education there, this lack of qualification recognition. I think there's an ongoing set of research. For instance, there's been the research by Professor Kosiakova in Germany looking at the integration of Ukrainian refugees, really highlighting that when there are pathways given to language skills, to cultural skills and recognition of qualifications, this can make a big difference. We see this also across the EU. The extent to which non-economic migrants can be motivated to work on the labor market is really policy dependent. So I think some more discussion of the heterogeneity of migration may be important there. If we go to the next slide, this should be a relatively ugly figure, looking at the employment gaps for migrants from the LFS, depending on, this is third country nationals. This is some work we did last year looking at economic and non-economic migrants. What I just want to highlight there is this, and that non-economic migrants are people who migrated for family reasons, to seek protection, and economic migrants are those looking specifically for work. Of course, huge difference between countries, but the main thing is that even in this third country group, which do less well than the intra-EU movers, you get big differences in whether people are pushed to go on the labor market or not. And then we can explain those differences with policy change, and that's really where the policy angle comes in, I think. Just want to highlight, Francesco already talked a bit about the importance of intra-EU movers. So wanted to highlight the fact that there are different flows of these, including posted workers, of course, which are not really taken into account on the study, which, I mean, you were doing a lot as it was. You can't do everything. But just to highlight that also there's huge variation. I understand with the EU Silk, it's impossible to differentiate between types of movers anyway, but to keep in mind that these are very different groups often and have very different outcomes. To the next slide then. So this is for me super confusing because I don't know if you see what I see, but my slide starts with non-standard work on the title, and hopefully your slides do too. Because now I'm moving to the next topic on non-standard work, where I really enjoyed the two papers I read, one on the social security rights that people build up for different types of non-standard work. I think that is really excellent because it highlights the extent to which otherwise similar types of non-standard work, think of part-time work or short contracts or short working hours, we can see them as very similar across EU member states, but they have very different repercussions in the national member state social security system. So this degree of precarity differs a lot, and I think that's mainly where this where the nuances you bring in this project are incredibly important. The fact that there isn't a European-wide perspective, but especially in the welfare state, we really have to look also at the member state level and what's happening in the social security legislation there. So supporting the trade union movement, we've been doing work on non-standard work, precarious work. And like your work, we found that actually a lot of different types of non-standard work are less prevalent, declining, which is positive. Some exceptions, which are the somewhat worst, like temporary agency work, is rising in a lot of countries, linked with a general greater use of outsourcing. And then the main issue is that on these types of work, we often don't have data. So there's issues of bogus self-employment, shorter zero work hours, unpaid jobs, mini jobs, flexi jobs, which we often can't capture very well in the data. And which, when we talked to trade union federations, what they're doing at the country level, are really seen as an issue. The second point that's really a bit of an issue on the non-standard work is also how it's distributed. With the view that some of these types of contracts are really clustered on the more vulnerable workers. Think migrant workers again, think the young but also lower educated. And when I read the very interesting work by Jonas Pontusson and colleagues on the preferences for welfare state, I was thinking, to what extent is the fact that we get a sort of differentiation between people who are more likely to work on these types of non-standard contracts and the more vulnerable workers who are less likely, and the more vulnerable workers who are more likely, to what extent can that play a role in the solidarity and the feelings towards having a more inclusive social security system? Can you all follow me still? Because I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but stop me if it stops making any sense. And then I also wanted to highlight a bit the double relation with social security. In some of the work I've done recently is on platform work, which is a very specific type of non-standard work. But there we really quite clearly saw that people are more likely to take up this type of platform work where they had fewer other options. And these other options we saw as a lack of labor market opportunities in the local area, in the region, but also a weak social security net. So we saw country differences where a lack of social security or a lack of a safety net led people to take up these more precarious types of gig work as a sort of supplement, of course. So a bit this double relation. I'm now moving to a slide that I'm going to skip, which is on the unequal distribution of different types of precarious employment. That's a bit from the work we've done, which just shows the spread over different groups. I've put the slides a bit too full so I can share them afterwards if anyone's interested, but it's not necessary to discuss them here. And then I want to just finish with remote work. First of all, to test everyone's Dutch, because there's some discussions on this in Flanders at the moment. Just as I was preparing for this talk, there was a discussion on getting civil servants back to the office without any sort of mention of why this was necessary. But the underlying message, of course, is that people are wasting time at home and it's much more productive to be at the office. And the person whose tweet I shared there is Peter Timmermans. He's the head of the employer federation in Belgium. So quite an important position where he very much supports this view that people have really abused the work at home system and that civil servants should really move back to the office because it is much, essentially as a type of punishment, I think, is the feeling behind it. I was really interested in the study shown by the colleagues from King's College, I think it was, on the bias against working from home. And I was wondering when reading it, to what extent is this distrust similar to everyone who works at home, or is it presumably gendered, but also by education levels or age? Are some people trusted more to work responsibly from home than others? The reason I'm saying this is because at the ETY, where we're doing some work during the COVID pandemic on the future of work and the extent to which people get the right to work from home, you see these big differences with mainly full-time male higher educated workers being more likely to work from home, and the role of worker representation in kind of putting this more equally. So to finish, I'm going to the slide labeled discussion, saying that I really enjoyed reading the papers, and I will follow the network much more closely to see what else comes out, because it was really, really excellent work, I think. My takeaway from this are really the importance of good and quality jobs, which of course is high on the EU agenda as well. And to think a bit also on what role is there in these different types for collective bargaining, worker representation in supporting quality jobs and supporting workers who are in non-standard types of jobs, or in this whole new future of work, what role is there for the more traditional social partners? With that, I'm gonna stop because I feel like I've abused your patience already, and I'm gonna leave it to the stars of today's events, the people of the project. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute.
Walter Schweizer, thank you so very much for your contributions. And you are very much one of the stars in this particular constellation. So thank you for joining the discussion and for your points which you have raised. As we have highlighted from the beginning, this is going to be the opportunity also for the audience to let its voice, or rather its questions, be heard. For those of you who are following us since the beginning, you will notice in the upper part of the webinar's window, the Q&A segment. I would invite you to write within it the questions that you might have for our panelists. And also, if you do not have any questions yourselves, to feel free to spotlight and upvote those questions which you do consider most interesting, that we might perhaps flag some of them and include them in our conversation. And what a conversation it is. I think we have been able to cover quite a bit over the course of the last few hours, for which I am very grateful. And I think that it's proven once more that these types of research questions benefit from the interaction between researchers, but also between contributors from other fields. If we could have those panelists that are still with us turning on their cameras at this stage, and as we move on to our full panel discussion. All right. Now, quite a bit has been shared over the course of this afternoon about perception and realities, perception from the public, perception from politicians, and of course, the answers, the contrasting answers quite often provided by research. And some of them, of course, warranting further research and investigation, but already, as a number of you have rightfully raised, some of them challenging but seem to be common assumptions, either in the public or common wisdom even amongst policymakers. You, Walter, have just now raised the case of the Flemish civil servants needing to return to the office, or at least being called to return to the office due to some of these perceptions. And so this is perhaps an opportunity to discuss the impact of perception in policymaking. In your experience, how tricky have you found it to fight the upstream battle between the scientific data and kind of like the either popular perception or the perception of the policymakers whom you've been trying to inform? If any of you wish to comment on the matter. Certainly, Hans Dubois.
Yeah, so maybe not precisely an answer to your question, but related, closely related. Also because I need to leave, so I wanted to make to tell it. But so I think rather than like perceptions, when you hear the word perceptions, you usually think about not so hard data and and that they may be wrong and we should change them, etc. But I think it's really important to understand the reasons behind these perceptions, and these perceptions can have very strong impacts. And it relates a bit to Francesco's comment on the difference, the importance to look beyond formal entitlements also, because just to give an example, in our report on social protection 2.0, you see that we map, for instance, that in several countries, depending on the type of residence permit, etc., migrants have actually access to unemployment for sure and minimum income schemes. But if for some of them, they perceive, and sometimes often that's true actually, that you cannot your residence permit or your long-term naturalization of obtaining a passport, etc., will get into danger if you apply for benefits. So while from a first look you only look at entitlements, like a very legal perspective, if you look a bit more beyond that and more at practice, how things work, including perceptions, actually, you see that things do not work the way you expected. So, just to emphasize that these perceptions should not be taken lightly.
Certainly. Hans Dubois, thank you so much for your contribution to this panel and to this webinar. Thank you for taking the time to stay with us up until now. We realize that the reality is that many of you have many other duties and occupations that are taking them elsewhere. And so we are lucky to have had your contributions up till now. Thank you again, and have a lovely day. Another one of our speakers who was not able to remain till the end is sadly Hee-Jung Chun, who did leave us with a few points that she has left to Gret and Hans. Speaking about Gret, she did highlight that it was great to see that the Commission is looking into gender stereotypes and aiming to abolish them and tackle them, but did highlight the question of getting men to care and into care sectors would be a great way. But also highlighted that one of the latest reports that she has released shows that about a third of Gen Z men agree that a wife should obey her husband, and that there's been almost a backlash against such a move with regards to young men rejecting men's role in care, with then the question of the need for stronger campaigns and advocacy to tackle, for example, the arguments and codes of the manosphere and hegemonic masculinity being promoted across social media platforms at the moment. So looking at public perception in this very specific context, in the context of sexism, etc., is there an uphill battle also with people's perceptions and associations that needs to be tackled first before policies can be effective? Or does one come with the other and it is a matter of implementing these changes with a measure of political courage? If you have any comments on the matter.
Yeah, I don't think it's a consequence one or the other. I think what we see for the moment is that there is a growing divergence between young men and women, and that also younger men tend to get more conservative views on roles of men and women, and that's something which is of concern for gender equality in overall, and it's extremely difficult to tackle, and it's very difficult to see where it comes from. I think we would have thought that with more rights, it would be very normal that men and women would be more involved in care, and that everybody would benefit from it. But we see that actually with the younger generation, this seems to be a little bit less kind of, I think we really are getting a bit worried that we lose a certain segment of society, and it's very difficult to see where this comes from. Does it come from social media? Does it come from more insecurity with regard to their roles? Does it come from the times, which are much more kind of insecure on different aspects, or some pressure? So it's really something to be followed up very clearly. And we also see differences across countries. So that's also another issue we need to really bear in mind. I think what we are trying to do is to kind of try and reflect on how can we make it feasible for both men and women to combine work with private life, and to get out of that idea that it's one or the other. It's either work or home, and trying to catch both young men and women to kind of make sure that they can see that it's feasible to do both. But it's a very tricky issue to do. We had an event a couple of weeks ago in Commission on Status of Women, which is the yearly UN meeting on gender equality, where we really tried to discuss this. It was not only related to care roles, but or remote work or whatever, which we're discussing here, but also in relation to gender-based violence and to certain bubbles men might get into, where they really start to promote this idea of men should be the one, women should be obey men, and those kind of issues. And we worked with men's organizations who like Equimundo or Men Engage, who really are trying to say that it's very important to break this cycle and to kind of have good practice examples, to kind of have men who kind of speak up in these fora to kind of show that this is not true. But of course, we are trying to find ways of tackle it without going straight against them, because that wouldn't work. I think it's very difficult to intervene on that. But I think we are watching this with very kind of great attention, and to really try and see what are the issues which need to be tackled. I think there is some kind of comment here saying that the tendency might come from economic insecurity. I think it's true. I think the economic insecurity and the fact that especially men feel that they should be able to provide and they don't find their role, I think could be a very important element to tackle. And I think it's an issue that we need to take into consideration. And it might also explain some of the results we found, which were found in He Jung's and the other research which was done on the attitudes.
Do we have any further comments or observations from our fellow panelists on the matter?
I don't want to comment on this, but at some point I want to have a conversation with Anton about whether we are really in a social democratic era or not. But that we can perhaps hold off on that if there is more on gender issues.
I mean, a very strong case could be argued for one conversation belonging with the other, especially kind of like given also Anton's comments earlier about the basket cases that we've been observing, be it the US, be it Slovakia, be it Hungary, etc. Would you, Anton, consider these to be can be said basket cases or canaries in the coal mine, where due to various reasons those might be the first states where we are observing kind of like these types of shifts? And if yes, kind of like what made those states and what made those governments particularly vulnerable? And are there lessons that can be taken then at the EU level, or maybe at individual national countries levels to counteract that backsliding?
I mean, this is a very tough question. So my sense, I would say, and also my hope, is that these are indeed basket cases and not canaries in the coal mine. But you know, on Trump, I was wrong the first time he was elected. I thought it wasn't going to happen, and I thought then later on after Brexit, you would think this is not going to happen again, and it did. So there's something that I find very difficult to explain. Whereas at the same time, as I'm reading these reports for the Bertelsmann Foundation, but also my work for the high level group, you know, there are many things that seem to go in the right direction. There are other things I can have a discussion with Jonas about this, that they're not going in the right direction, and it makes me and us reflect on a little bit, you know, what went wrong in the meantime. Maybe it was the third way. Maybe we were too tolerant with, you know, rising wealth inequality. Although, you know, again, if you look at the bottom half of the stratification ladder, I mean, European countries on the whole do pretty well. It's at the top that there are, you know, important differences, but also similarities. I think, you know, I mean, the number of billionaires per capita in Sweden and the US it may not be so different, but what is different is, you know, what is happening in the bottom half. And that's the thing where I still believe that the welfare state is doing a decent job.
Jonas, and maybe perhaps others, a commentary or response?
Well, there's been a lot of things discussed, and I'm going to get to Anton in 1 second, but I you know, I can't possibly address all of them. I very much agree with Hans, and I will send him an email about this, that the work I have been doing, and I think several of us, Sylvia included, have been doing, is focusing on atypical or non-standard work, and precarity among people with indefinite contracts is I think an issue that we have been we should be thinking more about, and there I think the issue of social protection gaps is less important, and the issue of collective bargaining and the sort of issues that Wouter brought up at the very end. And that's tricky, of course, if people don't want to join unions or whatever. And we know that non-standard workers or people on fixed-term contracts are just much less likely to join unions. But I do think that, and as I rewrite the paper that we circulated for this, I think this issue of right now we got there's a control for income, but we have, you know, standard and non-standard, and looking at, you know, to me the potential coalition is between the precarious non-standard and the non-standard in some sense. The other thing I was going to say, and I guess this goes to Anton at least, so, and this is a far too Swedish specific observation, but in 2000, 90% of the unemployed got unemployment insurance benefits. By 2011, 2012, less than 40% of the unemployed are getting the insurance benefits. They fall back on something called unemployment assistance, which has a replacement rate of about 20 or 25% or something like that. But the massive decline in coverage, and this is partly Swedish specific because unemployment insurance is voluntary in Sweden, but you know, there's been a fundamental change here, I think, and it was not necessarily engineered by the Social Democrats, but they went along with it in various ways. I think you're right that, well, with respect to part-time work, my impression is that most of these countries have part-time workers are in most of these countries fairly well covered by social insurance, both sick pay and unemployment insurance. whereas the other non-standard workers are. I don't see very many countries that where governments have done much to deal with the problem of irregular work histories and the need to accumulate either a certain amount of earnings or a certain amount of months of working during some reference period. I see very little reforms in that domain. And that seems, with respect to fixed-term employment, that seems to be the crucial thing. And just to go back to the stuff I presented, part-time workers seem to think that they're pretty well covered. They seem to be quite satisfied with their social benefits access, whereas the other non-standard workers are not. But I think that the social democratic policy dynamic persists in some domains, but has fallen behind in other domains, and I do think that's problematic. Of course, the backlash, it doesn't come from the non-standard workers that don't have access to unemployment insurance. The backlash comes from people who, in my mind, and this is a different conversation, but this all has to do with regional inequality in growth, right, or something like that. I mean, from what I can see in every single country, the backlash originates in hinterlands where the issue is less employment conditions and more public services and infrastructure and fewer shops and fewer schools and people leaving or something like that, right? I mean, that seems to be the key to me. That's the key to the backlash, and that could be critique of all of what we've been talking about, because Olaf has proven to us that immigrants are not a fiscal burden, but maybe immigration is not, or maybe the fiscal costs of immigration are not really what motivates the Trump voters or the Orban voters. They're actually concerned about local communities and lack of post offices and lack of stores and children leaving and going to the cities.
Right. Thank you, Jonas. Olaf, Sylvia. Yes, Olaf, you had a comment.
Yeah, so many thanks. I would like to start with saying many thanks to Anton and also to Wouter for your comments. And I would so also reflect a bit on what has been what has been said. So as Jonas said, indeed, the fiscal impact, that isn't more negative for immigrants. So that couldn't be, let's say, the reason from a perspective of the fact, let's call it from objective, but that also relates to the discussion that we have had about perceptions, and we know from experiments that from information treatments that even though the effect might be not negative or even positive, citizens might be not receptive to that. So that is one thing. Yeah, so probably that is one of the reasons that still in the political debate, the economic argument is still being used. Next to that, I would also agree with Jonas that other reasons, like cultural reasons about identity and religion or changing neighborhoods, that indeed plays a role in the whole debate about migration. In response to what Anton said about political backsliding and where did we go wrong in terms of political backsliding, I would agree with Jonas that indeed the local provision of public services, local libraries which disappeared, music schools which disappeared, local hospitals which disappeared, that is perhaps one of the main mechanisms and that also is an answer to where did we go wrong. But let's say that would be a more modern version of the embedded liberalism hypothesis, that it's not only redistribution in terms of unemployment benefits and social assistance benefits, but mainly also in terms of public services, so local hospitals, local libraries, schools, and that is where we went wrong. And if we think about EU debate in terms of labor migration and the union of skills, then this also relates to what Francesco said in terms of the coordination of social policies and social security. These results about the fiscal impact of migration are in a way that might be helpful for debate at the EU level. So there might be this fiscal impact apparently would not be a concern to think about more labor migration within the EU, and that might lead to more efficient allocation that would contribute to, let's say, welfare gains and more economic growth. But at the same time, if that does not translate into the local provision of public services, then that is why the political support for these ideas is lagging behind, I would say.
Well, definitely, thank you so much. Any response and comments on those observations from our panelists?
Yeah, maybe one on Olaf. As the welfare state is turning into, as the labor market is turning into a dual earner labor market, right? I mean, that's a general trend that we see everywhere. You know, there is a cultural backlash. You know, we may talk about it. So, but this is the general trend, and we're also facing huge labor market shortages. So, labor markets are going to get tight, is my expectation, especially in the care sector. But with this trend, the welfare state, you know, by definition becomes more service intensive. And then the question is, you know, how are services being provided? And this relates to childcare, but also long-term care, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, I mean, here, you know, capital cities like Amsterdam or Stockholm or Milan or Barcelona are at a advantage because, you know, they attract the high flyers. These high flyers on the whole vote for the left, which allows, you know, city governments to take, you know, social inclusion very seriously. So we do not have to worry about, you know, these type of cities. And there's interesting stuff going on in these cities that we should study nonetheless. But it's these sort of, you know, it's at the outside of these cities, what Jonas talked about, where, you know, these services are not being kept up for many reasons, right? I mean, it's not just for lack of will, but also for the fact that younger generations move towards these cities where there is a lot of activity, and who's to stop them? But yes, I think, you know, the general sentiment of, you know, these are really bad times, whereas, you know, if we look at some objective trends, they're not so bad. It probably has to do with these regional level inequalities and how they are being politicized, and how, you know, the center left doesn't really have an answer to that. And maybe that is sort of what I take from Jonas and Olaf's intervention. You're muted, Andrea.
Anton Hemmerich, thank you so much. Now, the point about the rural exodus and kind of like the younger generations rushing towards the cities is also being contrasted by the fact that cities are becoming more expensive. In fact, one point that Hee Jung-chon left behind before unfortunately needing to leave was that housing, as pointed out by Hans earlier, is an important point, but also that potentially companies that would allow workers to work more remotely for only meeting once a quarter or once a month would allow people to get onto better housing by allowing them to move away from the workplace and going into cheaper, more rural areas where the families live, addressing housing issues and also addressing kind of like the increasing cost of living crisis within urban areas. And so we see that there are a number of incentives that would encourage kind of like the promotion of these policies, and yet that are not being met. So where does that lack of prioritization come from at the national level or at the European level, according to you panelists? Or perhaps to highlight another, put it another way, what seem to be the pressures towards policymaking, kind of like that are the priorities at the European level, specifically in the current geopolitical context? Like TransEuroWorkS started in a very different time, and with the European Union being committed to different priorities, and now given some of the issues highlighted by Anton in the questions raised by Jonas Pontusson on the issues of democracy, on the issues of backsliding, but also with new challenges to standard work, such as the inclusion of AI having, for example, shifted kind of like the ways that many people are working and the work safety of a lot of people. Can we expect something to transform itself there at the EU level as well, or will the answer come more slowly or from elsewhere?
I guess I wanted to hear Greet talking about this, since you're more likely to be. So first we have the focus on competitiveness, and then we have the focus on military buildup or investment. Does social protection really end up being obviously priority for you, but for the Commission it becomes gradually less and less important?
It's a very difficult question for me to answer. I think there is definitely a shift in priority, and I really think we really feel, and I think all the it ultimately depends also on how member states will take this in a way. I think the Commission will continue to push forward certain elements, but maybe not with the same depth or impact as before, because there will need to be room for these new priorities, in particular defense, I think. But there will be a new European social pillar action plan that will come this year, and there will be actions in the social sphere that will come. And I think a lot will also depend on how the MFF discussions will map out, which will actually give more weight to what member states' priorities are going to be. So I think it's the combination of the two. I think that it's not that there won't be anything, it's just that we will need to make sure that they remain priorities also for EU member states to really invest in social protection, to kind of make sure. I think it's really important to kind of also communicate very clearly. If you don't invest in social protection and housing, etc., you risk losing part of your electorate in a way to more extreme sides, and then you kind of are dismantling even more. So I think it's a question of building up the arguments, and I think for that we will really need you and kind of need your research in order to kind of sell also to the policymakers, both within the Commission. I think with some DGs it's easier than with others, but also with the policymakers at national level, in order to kind of really highlight this. I think the question, the impact of AI and its impact on the way we function, etc., I think the EU is trying to kind of grapple with it. And I think also to reflect on ethical use of AI and how to do it, but it's a global kind of reflection as well. It's a global development, and it's a train which has started and which is very difficult to follow exactly what is going on, and trying to reflect on what will be the impact on all of the systems we have. And I think it's something which we are very much aware of, but where we are running behind reality to some extent. And we are, I think as EU, we are trying to do some things, but I think we cannot do it alone. I think otherwise we will fight a little bit against. So I think what is happening in the state really influences there very much. Also, the push on the EU on being more liberal on those kind of issues is really a very strong one. For the moment, I think we have not yet given up on it, but I think it's really important that we keep on reflecting on what is the impact and how can we do it in the most ethical way in order not to create more discrimination or disadvantages for certain groups of the population. And I think all the groups we talked about today are kind of at stake. It's a very generic answer, and I'm not sure whether I really answered fully, but it's a first attempt in a way.
Not to worry. Not to worry.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rit Vermeulen. Sigrid Hiardi, perhaps for a final word. Your research pointed to the fact that more often than not, states are lagging behind in terms of their regulations, the realities of the modern job market, and that specifically through the lens of social protection, one could see that the tools weren't quite there to capture the needs and realities of modern forms of non-standard employment. Do you see this change? What do you see as a possible catalyst for this to change? Will states and the EU manage to catch up on time, or will it take something more fundamental in terms of discrepancy for adjustments to take place?
Well, it's a big question. I really need to leave in a minute, so I will try to keep it short. But I think I think your point about what tells our studies is also to look at new forms of work, like multiple job holding and the like. So that's what we really tried to do when we were trying to disentangle the different dimensions of contractual flexibility. And I don't see much of this reflection going on in the policy making, but I'm not part of the policy making. So, as a scholar, I normally study things when they have already happened. So I don't think the question is very much for me for how I see that the policy making could act upon. I think, we've seen that what really drives the access to unemployment benefits, how the rules are designed. I think Olaf and Jonas and their teams have developed this fantastic indicator on accessibility to unemployment benefits. And that really shows how much the nuances in the rules make the difference for making a system more or less accessible. So I think that will be my very short answer, and I really need to go now because I have another thing at 5 elsewhere. So we are a bit past the time. But thanks a lot for organizing this panel, and thanks for the discussants for the interesting inputs.
Thank you to each and every one of you for your input, for your research, for your time, which, as we know, is not something we can take for granted. And thank you, of course, to our loyal audience who remained until the very end. Should you wish to learn more, we, of course, encourage you to try and investigate the TransEuroWorkS website, transeurowworks.eu. And of course, we hope that you will give a look at the recording of this event, should you want to revisit some of its points. Until then, from me and from my colleagues, it is thank you, it is goodbye. Thank you for your time, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.